Greetings all, Ferrari-Man601 here. In our final spate of 2017 Formula One car launches, Haas were the first to take the wraps off of their 2017 challenger, the VF-17. Capitalizing on a string of points finishes to start off 2016, Haas are approaching their sophomore year in Formula One with a great deal of optimism, unveiling this rather nice, somewhat radical design, especially considering that the American-based outfit are only in their second year in Formula One, and in terms of their resources, they can't even begin to compare to some of the more well-established teams on the grid. However, what we see here in the VF-17, on the face of it, is very encouraging from the Carolina-based Haas F1 team. First off, what we are seeing on the car is Haas are in the thumbnail nose club. As we can see here, clearly we have a thumbnail nose on the front end of the Haas. This is in keeping with every car except Mercedes right now anyway. Toro Rosso have also unveiled their car, and I don't want to give away anything yet to those of you who may not have seen it. However, so far, only Mercedes running a traditional triangular nose tip that tapers down to a point. Everybody else running either this thumbnail nose or a finger nose, namely Force India running a more finger-type projection rather than a thumbnail one. Pulling away from the nose section in particular at the moment, just have a look at the overall design of this car. It looks very well put together as a complete package. It's not as well developed as some other cars that we have seen, however, it is certainly not the least complex development that we have seen so far on the grid. That dubious honor, I'm afraid, has to go to Force India as of right now. The Haas in general looks like it is a fairly well-conceived package straight out of the box, and of course, as we zoom in here, first of all, apologies, we are going to have some image cut off here because the resolution is just a little bit too high for my screen. However, you can definitely see the technical details across the car here, particularly in the midsection where we have some Canard wing activity. We have at least 2-layer barge boards going on there on the lower side of the front midsection before we get into the floor, which I have to say is rather highly sculpted and more comparable to the Mercedes than any other car that we have seen so far, at least in launch spec. Additionally, we can see front and rear suspension detail. The front suspension looks to be pushrod, as we have seen on all of the cars thus far, and the rear suspension looks to be pull rod, as we have seen on most of the other 2017 cars. Returning to the front end for a moment, we can see, in addition to the nose tip, which is of course that thumbnail projection, we can also see some interesting activity going on the front wing proper. We can see these cascade elements here on the left side of the car screen right for us. Very nice development work going on. It doesn't look like anything too individualized, too spectacular in the context of the rest of the field. However, it is good to see Haas, again only in their second year in Formula One, starting to make hay in this development area. I do, however, want to draw your attention to these two inverted U channels on the inboard and outboard surfaces of the front wing. Haas, like Ferrari and like Mercedes and like Williams, are running these two inverted U channels on the front wing. We're not seeing this on all of the cars, however, we are seeing it on what are most likely to be the front runners. So interesting to see that Haas have also developed this concurrent philosophy of developing a front wing. Very interesting detail. Another interesting detail that we're seeing on the Haas, we can see somewhat obscured in this shot, we can see these pre-barge boards along the front end. And this was something that I first noticed on the Mercedes and then later on with the Ferrari. However, it's interesting to see a small team like Haas also making strides in developing this section of the car. I don't think anybody has anything quite as radical as McLaren, who have these strakes running across the bottom section of the front nose cone, sort of integrating them with the mounting pylons for the front wing. However, Ferrari and Mercedes and now Haas have these pre-barge boards in this section of the nose structure on the car. Very interesting. Of course, as I mentioned before, we can see the front suspension in this shot, double wishbone pushrod in the front. Very standard design, and it does seem to be the best way to develop a Formula One front suspension. Additionally, on the nose, we can see a very smooth profile going from the top of the chassis down to the nose tip. There is no step to be seen on this car, and there's no step to be found on any of the 2017 Formula One cars, with the notable exception of Force India, who appear to have gone in a different direction with their front suspension design. I think they're anticipating some form of protest in Australia about the front suspension damper systems. However, I think we're going to see majority rule on this, and it will be thrown out because every car on the grid except for the Force India has no step, so I don't think we're going to see any fruition from that protest, although I am sure Force India, now being the odd man out, are going to lodge one, because that's how the politics works in this sport. Moving toward the midsection of the car, I made mention of canard wings. Here they are. Let's go for the circle tool there, because that didn't help us at all. Here they are, the canard wings, similar in placement and geometry to the wings that we see on the Mercedes. However, they are not as complicated in terms of their overall design as they are on the Mercedes, although their relative size and location again is similar to what we see on the Mercedes chassis. I would say the rationale behind those canard wings is about the same as it is on the Mercedes, because you want to take airflow coming in from the front, and then of course you want to direct it partially into the radiators and then partially into the turning vanes to then turn it around the rear section of the car, as we see there, to feed the diffuser. Very interesting design there. Speaking of turning vanes, we have some turning vanes, and this design is actually quite similar to what we see on the Mercedes. We can see, first of all, we have the vertical strake element of the turning vane running here. It looks like it's angled slightly rearward, however, I think that's more so an artifact of the angle from which this shot was taken rather than the geometry of the vane itself. However, we also see it integrated with this horizontal winglet across the top of the side pod. So very similar in design to the Mercedes in terms of having a continuous element horizontally and vertically connected to one another. Very nice, and again, very cool to see a smaller team developing something like this. Additionally, we have what look to be some vortex generators right here in this area. You can see these jagged triangular projections on what looks to be the lower surface, the underside surface of that horizontal winglet running this way across the top of the side pod. It does not look to be mounted on the side pod itself, on the top side of the side pod, rather on the lower surface of the turning vane. So interesting development in that respect. Moving toward the rear of the car, we can see that there is some very nice packaging going on here, with the bodywork meeting up with the floor roughly in this area, and then you have a whole lot of space to play with on the floor. If we just draw our triangular section, you can see all of this space to play with on the floor section of the Haas, and of course that's going to play great dividends in getting the air to flow around the side pod and then in to the diffuser section of the car. Very cool, and again, very good design from Haas so far. In terms of the floor detail, we can definitely see there's a lot of work going on here. Just look at the geometries on this section of the floor here, just below the Haas logo on the side pod. First of all, you can see we have a straight section coming just from behind the barge board to this point, and then we have a dip in the floor here, this little vein area, before it turns upward to about 70-80 degrees in this section. So there's a lot of very sophisticated geometry going on with this Haas. And then of course beyond that, just like we've seen on several other cars thus far, we have these louvers, striations, turning vanes, whatever you want to call them, cut into the section of the floor just in front of the rear tire. Again, this is just trying to get the air turned toward the rear section of the car and toward the diffuser. Very, very nice detail. And this section in particular does seem to be separating the men from the boys in terms of the guys who really have their designs well thought out, at least here in launch spec. Now, launch spec, of course, it is somewhat difficult at times to divine particular details because the teams tend to hide things from us, but a lot of teams are showing us these little louvers cut into this section of the floor. A few others are not. That does not necessarily mean that they will not have them, but it does mean that they don't want us to see them yet. McLaren in particular don't have development going on in this section, nor do Force India. almost understandable from Force India that maybe they wouldn't. But McLaren, with the resources they have, I hope that they are simply just trying to pull the wool over our eyes a little bit and just save that for testing so that we don't see everything too soon. Additionally, we can see Haas has joined the shark fin club, and they are running a rather large shark fin over the engine cover here. I like the sculpting work that's going on with this fin. It comes in from the rear section, moving upward at about 45 degrees toward the front of the car before doing the same, but in the opposite direction toward the rear, again at about 45 degrees, before coming up to a point along its upper surface. You can see the upper profile of that fin going up to the roll hoop there. Very nicely designed. I definitely like it, and it does show that Haas have some very good aerodynamicists, and they have a great capacity to design parts and then to produce them with a high degree of precision. Definitely liking that. In terms of the rear wing, somewhat more simplistic end plates than we've seen on some other cars. Again, we do have these gills cut into the upper surface of the end plates there, again just to control the airflow as it goes across the wing in this direction, and then of course at higher and higher speeds you're going to get a higher and higher pressure across this wing, and you could start to get some turbulence building up around this boundary layer on the wing itself, and therefore it would negate the effects of that wing. However, you just want to have these gills here to bleed some of the air out from the wing and control that high pressure flow as it's going across to generate downforce. Very interesting detail, and we're seeing this on all of the cars thus far. Additionally, we can also see the DRS actuator strut in this section here. This is coming off from around the exhaust mounting point. This is going to house a whole bunch of hydraulic lines that are going to be running up through here just to feed that high pressure hydraulic fluid to the actuator assembly itself, which is up in this area here. We can also see the DRS armature linkage on this section of the rear flap. Again, that's to connect that DRS actuator to the flap itself so that we can then open and close the slot gap there by moving this upper element of the wing flap, opening and closing DRS. Very nice detail there, and somewhat elegant mounting solution, I have to say. Not too many other teams are running this large strut, large pylon here, but I like it on the Haas, and it looks to be very nicely sculpted as well. Have a look at this S-bend in it. Very nicely done. That is not an easy shape to produce in carbon, I can tell you that much. And that Haas have that capacity tells me that they are certainly very serious about this season, and they're throwing all of their resources at it. And on this next shot, we can see the car from a front-end vantage point. Again, we're going to be cut off a little bit due to the high res. However, let's start on the front. We can get a much better look at the front wing section on this car, and just look at the development work that little Haas are doing on this car. Again, this is indicative of a team that really has its priorities in order. Even though they are smaller, they have it together. Absolutely. Let's try and count how many individual elements there are. I'm counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on the main flap, and then an additional, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4 on the cascade element, in addition to the main profile of the bottom section of the wing running in this plane here. Very, very nice development work going on in North Carolina. Absolutely loving this. This car certainly looks very, very good for these guys. It's already looking better than the Force India at very least, although perhaps we can say that's not much of an achievement. But very nice work from Haas. I am certainly impressed. We can get a better look at the nose. Again, they are running this thumbnail appendage as we've seen on every other car so far except for the Mercedes. However, we can see that Haas are running these pretty much perfect rectangular sections in the nostril area here, unlike on the McLaren, which has a little bit more of a sculpted appearance, somewhat of a rhomboid shape moving toward the nose. We can see the Haas is pretty much rectangular in nature, the McLaren having a geometry somewhat resemblant of the two black lines that I have drawn in there. Very interesting indeed. Get a better look across the front suspension here. Again, we are double wishbone and push rod. We can see our wishbone elements of the suspension and then our push rod running from the chassis to the center line of the wheels in that geometry there. Very, very cool. Again, the push rod, the rationale being that the car is going to be loaded in this direction from bumps on the road, and therefore you're exerting a force into the chassis in this direction, again following the geometry of the push rod element, which is right here. You're going to load the chassis up at a 45-degree angle to dampen the bumps and any other oscillations that are induced. Very cool, and again, everybody going for that double wishbone push rod arrangement on the front end. Also on this shot, we can get a little bit better angle now on those canard wings. They're relatively simplistic in their overall geometry. They're just these triangular strakes looking very similar to what Ferrari ran on the F2007 and F2008 coming up on 10 years ago. However, very nice to see that design element incorporated with the Haas. And again, it looks like the overall rationale for that airflow just to capture it as it comes around the front suspension and then direct it partially into the radiators and then direct some other sections of that down into the side pod and then around the floor and start to blow the diffuser and rear section of the car. Very, very nice. Speaking of the center and rear section of the car, have a look at the packaging going on here. Of course, we have our radiator inlets here and here, but if we look toward the bottom of those, you can just see this very slim profile that just wraps itself around both sides of the side pods toward the floor section and toward the rear end. Very nicely done, boys. Absolutely loving this. Also, we can get a better view on these turning vanes. Again, they are single element turning vanes, but they incorporate a horizontal and vertical element just like we're seeing on the Mercedes. Very cool. We can also see these small stays just to add a little bit more side bracing to, first of all, add some integrity to the turning vanes, but also perhaps to condition a little bit of that airflow as it passes through them on roughly this plane here. Very cool details on this car. I am liking it very much already, and also I have to say the livery is very similar to what we saw from Haas last year. However, I'm liking it. It's simple but striking, and it certainly gets the job done. Very, very nicely done indeed. Moving toward the center section of the top side, we can see the cockpit area, again very similar to what all the other teams are running because this is essentially homologated. However, we can also get a better look at the rear wing end plates in terms of their profile geometry. Vertical, turning inboard on themselves a little bit before going vertical again. Very similar to what we have seen on all of the other 2017 cars thus far. Also, they've got the Ferrari engine, the airbox treatment, very similar to what we've seen from Ferrari. Just a single inlet here, no splitting of that flow as it goes into the airbox, at least from what we can see on the outside. Very nice touch. We see a conventional mirror placement on these conventional looking stalks, as we can see here, just initially coming out at 90 degrees from the side of the chassis, as we can see here, before sharply turning upward, and then we get into the mirror fairing. Very nice, and I don't think there will be any concerns about that particular detail. Very, very cool. In addition, what we can see on this shot, we can see some interesting detail on the floor. Draw your eyes toward this section of the car on both sides. You can see that we have a little bit of a slot gap from the side of the floor to this external vane. Very cool. On the previous shot, this was an area of the floor that just looked to be somewhat upturned. However, we can see here that this is in fact a gap, and I've not noticed a detail like this on any other car so far. So perhaps we've just seen launch spec floors on some of the cars and the other teams have thought of things like this and they just haven't wanted to show it to us yet, but Haas, the first team to show us a detail like this on the floor. Very interesting design, and I'll be very interested to see what this looks like, maybe if we get some shots of this car with some flow viz on it, but also when the last day of testing happens at Barcelona, it will be wet. Whether it rains or they wet the track artificially, it remains to be seen, but that test will be wet, they promise us. So to look at some shots of the water flowing around this car as they're going down the straights, it's very easy to visualize the airflow in those sorts of conditions, so I'll be very interested to see some pictures of the Haas in the wet and to see if we can find any difference in the flow patterns around this section of the floor versus what Haas or what the other teams are going to be doing. Very, very interesting. And on this next shot, we see an overhead view of the VF-17. Zooming in again, we're going to see some cutoff, but as we can see on the front end, we can get a little bit different perspective on that front wing design. Again, that ubiquitous delta profile along the leading edge of the wing, homologated for this year, but the shot does highlight it a little bit more nicely for us. In addition, you can see the locations of the mounting pylons on the nose structure here. The wing itself is mounted very far back on its trailing surface, and this is another trend that we're seeing on a lot of the cars, but looking at the amount of material there actually in contact with the wing main plane surface, it does not look very large. So when we consider the amount of forces that are going through the front wing of a Formula One car, particularly at speed, we could easily see several hundred, perhaps over 1,000 pounds of down load going on this wing. So for all of that force to be channeled into those two very small pylons is a pretty remarkable feat of engineering, that the wing just doesn't fall off whenever the car starts to pick up some speed. So that's another very nice design feature, and it certainly shows that Haas have some very good engineering. From this shot, we can also get an above view of the suspension profile. Again, double wishbone pushrod. You can see the profile of the wishbones here on the front end, going from the center line of the front wheels into the chassis with the pickup points, and then of course you can see roughly in the center here the rough profile of the push rods going across the car. Again, everything converging at those center lines of the front wheels, as you would expect. Also on this shot, we can see the barge board detail. I mentioned that the barge boards may have some multiple profiles going on, and sure enough, we see that here with these secondary elements forward of the principal element of the barge boards there. Very interesting detail. Somewhat of a divergent trend so far in terms of what the barge board design has been in 2017, because it's not a new area of development, but it's a resurrected, revitalized area of development. Teams really have not been playing with barge board design since 2008. Yes, we've seen some small barge board-like appendages on some of the cars since then, but really full-fledged barge boards have not been in the sport for almost 10 years now. So very interesting to see this come back, and very interesting to see the multiple design solutions the teams are coming up with. In addition to the anterior surfaces of the barge boards, we can also see this rather generous amount of space immediately behind the barge boards and immediately in front of the side pods and the radiator inlets. Remember that we're dealing with a multi-profile surface here. First of all, we have the radiator inlets themselves, but then the car tucks into itself underneath those radiator inlets, giving us a very sculpted profile, roughly following this sort of trajectory, and then it unifies with the outer edge of the side pod. So the side pods sort of tuck into themselves a little bit. So this space right here behind those barge boards, it may, again, just be for the airflow to sort of smooth out a little bit and expand into this area so that perhaps the pressure drops some, so it's a little bit easier, perhaps, to direct some more of that airflow into the radiator inlets, first of all, as well as for the turning vanes then to start to pick up the flow and start to direct it around the car like that. The other detail that we can get a better angle of from this shot is the corrugations, the turning vanes, the slots cut into the rear section of the floor here in front of the rear tires. This is a very intricate design. It reminds me most of what Renault are doing. It also bears some resemblance to Mercedes, but for the most part these look more similar to the Renault ones, despite them being actual slots like we've seen on the Mercedes. So it's a little bit of a blended design between the Renault and the Mercedes. Again, it has the same rationale, just trying to get that airflow to condition and turn itself in toward the rear of the car to feed the diffuser section and the upper side of the floor. Also, it may have some small benefit to conditioning the flow around the rear tires. Again, this is going to be very, very turbulent as it comes off of the rear, so any bit of smoothing, calming actions you can get across the car in this direction, headed toward the rear, to create a more linear flow across the surface of the rear tire, as well as to direct air around the rear tire and toward the lower section of the rear wing, is going to be desirable here in terms of reducing drag. The final detail here that I just want to draw everybody's attention to, look at the packaging. Once again, just like the Ferrari and just like the Mercedes, Haas have a very slim profile across their rear section, and as we highlighted on the previous shot, that gives them all of this space here to play with in terms of free area for air to flow, and that creates opportunities for development as they start to get smarter about how the car actually behaves aerodynamically in the real world. I'm sure there always are some minuscule differences between how a car behaves in a wind tunnel in CFD and then how it actually works out when you get it out on track. So this area right in here is a space to watch, not only on the Haas, but on all of the cars this year as the engineers get smarter about how they work and once they get some data back from testing. Also, we can see the rear wing main plane profile here, very similar to what we've seen on other cars, but I do want to point out you do not see nearly as large a depression in the center section of the flap where that DRS actuator comes in as we do on some other cars. Some of the cars have a very deep depression sort of following this sort of line in between the two flaps on the rear wing main plane. However, the Haas does not seem to have this, and I think it's just a product of how that DRS armature interacts and interfaces with the main plane in terms of how their actuator is set up, and are they trying to utilize maybe a small low pressure zone behind the actuator itself as the air flows across it. I'm not sure, just speculation on my part. But if you have a body, let's make a very bad rendition of a DRS actuator here, roughly this sort of shape, and then of course you have your armature going off of it. If you have a body with air going across it in this direction, you're going to have a vacuum created in this area. Now this is a zone of low pressure, it is drag per se, but at the same time you may be able to get a small aero benefit just by having something that is not going to impede the low pressure zone that's expanding behind this DRS actuator. That could be one reason why we're seeing that depressed section in the center of rear wing main planes, but again, we're not seeing that on the Haas, just a little bit of speculation on my part. And on this shot, we see a profile view of the VF-17, and this is going to allow us to get a little bit more sense of the actual proportions of the barge boards. They're large, but they're not quite as large as the ones Sauber are running. This could be due to the multi-element profile in the barge boards, as we can see here. You can see the two elements, the outer and inner elements, working with each other there. It could also just be because that's not the philosophy that they're following in terms of the front-end aero on this car. Additionally, here we are able to see these Canard wings in a little bit better detail. You can see the overall angle of them. It is facing slightly downward along this axis here, so you can get a sense of how they are trying to manipulate that flow across the front of the car. They are trying to angle it downward toward the radiator inlets, I would say, and perhaps some spillover into the turning vane area. In addition, we can talk about those turning vanes. I mentioned that they might be somewhat angled rearward, and we can see that indeed they are. Interesting open curved design on these turning vanes. They're not quite as rudimentary as the ones we've seen on the Sauber. You can definitely tell that there is a curve on the rearward side of these vanes. Very nice design, and again, we will see if there are any aero gains to be made in that area. We talked about the profile of the floor, and you can definitely see it here. We have a flat section of the reference plane here, and then we get into the corrugations rearward, and then we also have this upturned area over to screen left, so toward the front section of the car. So you can definitely see that there are some very interesting geometries going on the floor of the Haas. In addition, we talked about the shark fin a little bit before, but we can see it here in a full profile view, and you can just get a sense of its overall proportions and the angles in question. Additionally, there's one more detail that this shot does divulge that we have not seen yet in the others. You can see on the rear wing and fences we have some more strakes, gills cut into the lower surface there. We've seen this on many other cars so far this season, and again, the rationale is the same. Just try to clean up that flow as it's coming around the rear tire and perhaps redirect some of it out through the center section of the car to expand outward and create that downforce. Otherwise, like we've said, you get all this turbulence spinning off of the rear wheels, and that just creates drag. Two more details that we can discern from this shot. First of all, we have the profile of the side pods from the area of the radiator inlet down to the rest of the bodywork, where we join up again with the reference plane, and then we move out in this very nice sweeping fashion toward the rear, where of course we want the air to accelerate out in this sort of rooster tail fashion. The other detail that we can discern from this is that Haas are running a lot of rake in the car. If we draw a line from about here, where the bottom of the T-tray should be, to the ground, you will notice that when we do the same on the rear, the line coming down from the floor on the rear is markedly longer. It looks to be about twice the length. So you can start to eyeball the ratio of ride height from front to rear on the Haas, and again, this is indicative of a lot of rake being dialed in to the chassis. Now, there are two principal reasons why you would want to run rake in a Formula One car. The first one is chiefly aerodynamic. You will notice that if we look at the profile of the underside of the car, we create this sort of wedge shape moving from front to rear, with the rear being higher. Therefore, when we take into consideration the ground, which is of course straight and level, we're going to assume in this instance, you'll notice that we create this V shape relative to the bottom of the car. And what this does is just accelerates the airflow coming in from the front, it pressurizes it underneath the center section of the car, and then as the air moves toward the rear of the vehicle, we start to see it expand out the back, and it turns up when it does that, and this is our chief generator of downforce on the bottom of the car anyway. Of course, lots of topside aero back again nowadays, so those front and rear wings and turning vanes also going to go to great lengths to create more downforce. The other reason why you run rake in a Formula One car is quite simply weight distribution, center of gravity. The designers, engineers, and drivers alike, they all try really hard to create a 50-50 weight balance in the car, because of course when you have just as much weight on the front axle as you do on the rear axle, you're going to get similar behavior on the front and rear, and therefore the car is going to want to turn a whole lot more easily. There will be less centrifugal force acting on one side versus another, talking longitudinally here, front to rear, so that your understeer and oversteer situations are going to be minimized. However, running rake in the front also in a rear-heavy car will serve to move that center of gravity forward, so that you get better bite on initial turn-in with those front wheels. Also, again, as I mentioned, it's an aero benefit. If you want to dial understeer out of the car, you want more down load going on the front end of the car. So of course you can add front wing to solve an understeer situation. Again, you want to get that downforce working on the front axle, but you can also move the center of gravity forward a little bit just by dropping your front ride height. Of course, within limits here, we don't want to be scraping the tarmac too much, but again, just couple of reasons why you'd want to run rake in a Formula One car, and Haas, amid some other teams, certainly doing that. And on this last shot here, we can see the car out on track under natural lighting conditions, Romain Grosjean in the cockpit. Haas completed some running today as part of a PR exercise, a filming day. Several teams have done this. Of course, everybody's already in Barcelona just waiting for the tests to get started. However, we know this is a filming day because we can see that there is a GoPro camera affixed to the front left suspension there. Perhaps it's on the actual camera mount. I can't really tell from this shot, but you can see that GoPro camera there. A little crude, but considering that F1 cars used to run with full feature movie cameras on the roll hoops in the 60s and 70s. This is certainly an improvement in technology. But no, the F1 cars will not be carrying GoPros, I would assume, during the testing sessions. But just a nice little shot there, and actually kind of cool to see this backyard ingenuity going on. Oh, we want a shot of the front wheel. Let's put a GoPro on it. Formula One, we're used to seeing these high dollar solutions to somewhat simple problems in some cases, but Haas being a smaller team, although I have to say they've done a great job designing this car from what we've seen of it so far, just nice to see them taking a cheap solution here and putting a $200 or $300 GoPro on the car versus trying to come up with some sort of extravagant, elegant solution just to get some simple shots of the left front tire as Grosjean is going around Barcelona. Anyway, that's all I've got to say about the Haas VF-17. This is a very exciting car for me, being from the United States, and of course I've been very pleased with the performances that Haas have put in over 2016, and from this analysis here, I have no reason to believe that we should not expect anything less from them this year. So, with that said, I do wish Haas all of the best for this year, and I hope that we see them shine. Maybe, just maybe, this car will be able to fight pretty decently in the mid-pack, especially since Haas has already done that in the beginning part of 2016. This is not a bad-looking car by any means. We'll see how that Ferrari engine works for them, but again, I think we have very good reason to be optimistic for Haas this year. Until next time, I just want to thank all of you for watching and, of course, for your continued support and your continued engagement. Ferrari Man 601 saying thank you very much, and we will see you soon.